My opponent is arguing that civil disobedience in a democracy is not justified. However, I tend to negate his stance. While debating, he wanted to uphold the value of pragmatism, which in the definition he asserted that you must uphold the law. But civil disobedience isn't breaking the law. They are simply peacefully protesting against what they deem right and justified. We are granted the right to peacefully protest in the United States, for example, which is democratic, by the U.S. Constitution, which protects the rights of all citizens. Also, you said civil disobedience threatens order. However, I believe the infringement upon rights creates more chaos because civil disobedience, as defined, it's only the peacefully protesting. And when you gave the Ferguson example, when the government intervenes, they're the ones that create the chaos, and they're infringing upon the rights of citizens, which in the United States, which, as you gave the example, we're supposed to have freedom for all. So technically the government is the one that is creating the chaos. And with that, you said it leads to violence. But however, violence would not be an issue if, once again, they did not infringe upon the rights, which goes back to John Locke saying that if they infringe upon the rights of citizens, we have the right to come above that power, and whosoever uses force without right, as everyone does in society, who does it without law, puts himself into a state of war with those against whom he so uses it. And in that state, all former ties are canceled and all other rights ceased, and everyone has a right to defend himself and to resist the aggressor. Therefore, that which John Locke goes back to the United States Constitution, which is outlined in specifically the First Amendment, that citizens have the right to overcome over the infringement upon their rights, which is all they're doing when they're exercising their actions in civil disobedience. And you also stated that no matter what, in a democratic society, you have to follow the law, and that even if citizens don't agree with it, but once again, going back to John Locke, we have the right to advocate for what we deem right and justified in society, and that's with civil disobedience, we're only advocating for what we seem fit. And when you said MLK is an exception to civil disobedience, however, MLK is not only an exception, he fully exemplifies how effective civil disobedience is, because he only believed in civil disobedience, and it was one of the greatest movements in the United States to ever exist. And then you talked about de-individuation, where people become involved in the crowd when they are involved in these political protests. However, in a democratic society, citizens have the right to have a voice. And you said that de-individuation, you're only becoming part of the group, but through civil disobedience, you're not becoming part of the group. You're forming together as a voice for America to advocate for change in policy. And then you argued about the South African government and Beijing, for example, and then you brought in Gandhi's examples of nonviolent protest. However, these were non-democratic societies, and we are arguing that if they're justified in a democratic society, therefore your argument is invalid.
Okay, since my opponent is so enamored with democratic society, we'll talk about that for a little bit. First of all, civil disobedience cannot be justified because it subverts democratic processes. Civil disobedience is never justifiable in a reasonably healthy democratic community. It is unjustifiable, not simply because it breaks the law, but because in breaking the law, it deliberately violates the procedural rules that an operating democracy presupposes. These rules, which set limits on a manner in which participants may seek to influence community decision-making, are the foundation of a just government. Therefore, when they are deliberately disregarded or defied, the loss is profound, greater by far than whatever good might flow from the effective protest against the one substantive evil. Indeed, although the civil disobedient claims to act within the frame of the legal system, his act is in effect a deep form of revolution, procedural if not substantive. He subverts the entire game by deliberately breaking its rules. He applies a form of pressure illegitimate in the political arena, thereby violating the principle of majority rule. He creates in effect a state of war between himself and his community, forcing the community to respond similarly and subverting and rendering the inapplicable democratic process that, in the whole, is far more to be prized than any goal fought for by one group of people. I don't claim this argument is that a protest made through normal channels can be as effective as civil disobedience, or that the same results can be achieved. Rather, I'm suggesting that however inadequate the citizen may find the normal channels of democratic political action in achieving a given end, those inadequacies do not justify the abandonment and subversion of the system. I maintain not merely that civil disobedience upsets a government of laws, but that it disrupts the orderly, non-violent processes through which those laws come to be formulated and adopted. The point is that the democratic decision-making is probably the outcome of pushes and pulls by participating interest groups. And there have got to be rules about how hard one may push. Some pushes are so vigorous that they throw the whole process out of kilter. Civil disobedience is of that kind. It makes the orderly continuation of a bargaining, compromising process difficult or impossible. It functions as a kind of threat, a political blackjack, which forces the opponents either to knuckle under the pressure or resort to devices equally threatening and disruptive, thereby leading to the progressive degeneration of effective democratic processes. My opponent also argued that civil disobedience is the most effective method in changing policy. However, this is not the case. Civil disobedience is self-defeating in itself. The practice of civil disobedience defeats its own purposes. Even when its objectives are worthy, the deliberate unlawfulness it involves creates in the minds of both legislators and the general public a widespread feeling of resentment and anger. By making enemies rather than friends, and by offending innocent bystanders, the civil disobedient produces an adverse reaction to his cause, and undermines thereby his own larger objectives. Civil disobedience cannot be justified, therefore, by the claimed advancement of worthy goals, since its ultimate effect is not their achievement, but the very regression of their advancing. Although civil disobedience is nonviolent, as my opponent argues, it's undeniable that many forms of protest from civil disobedience result in violence, such as Ferguson, such as Baltimore, where even though the government came in to stop the already ensuing violence, more violence resulted. Just for instance, 300 deaths in Baltimore riots this summer, just from not the police, but from homicides. That's outrageous. So, even though some forms of political disobedience, like, for example, the public destruction of one's draft card, or the public desecration of the flag, cause direct inconvenience for virtually nobody but the disobedient himself, yet it may provoke an almost wild response from the public. Destruction of one's draft card has no effect upon his eligibility for induction or upon administrative process. But this act sometimes arouses the most bitter animosity in persons not themselves subject to induction. The showing of disrespect for the flag by a single person or a small minority has no significant effect on anybody, but it can be severely punished by law and will drive some patriots into rage. Acts of protest, especially when disobedient, can offend by their symbolic impact as well as controversial, as it is the act that is harmless but symbolically necessary in the eyes of the protester. It may be honorable or symbolically offensive in much of his audience as well. So even though the protester is offended by the injustice they are receiving, it doesn't give them the right to be careless of the rights of the others involved. The majority under the law that is following the law, that's going through legal channels to help change policy through interest groups, which have a great effect on policy change. So you can't forget the rights of the majority. So do the rights of the minority outweigh the rights of the masses? I know the rights of minorities are important, but there are other legal means within the political system to change laws. No, that's good. So overall, because of that other method, civil disobedience is never justifiable.